stuff that we've gotten on Facebook already this morning. Somebody wrote in and said, my son is on risperidone. Did I say that correctly? My question is, how serious are the claims that this drug is causing breast growth? I have not heard this before.
I actually have, I don't remember if I've read about this or not, but I don't think Risperdal or risperidone is having an effect. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is some research, but it's got to be very tiny. Risperdal is an antipsychotic medication, so I can't imagine how it would be affecting hormones. I don't know. And as a whole, we want to try to stay away from antipsychotic medications because, I mean, antipsychotic medications are not really helping anything. They're just kind of, I guess, numbing the symptoms. It's kind of like taking Tylenol, I suppose, or something that will kill the pain for that period of time. It doesn't really solve why the pain is there or what the issue is to begin with, so it doesn't have any interaction with what's causing it. Same thing with risperidone. It's just it's basically for things like aggression or pretty severe self-stimulatory behaviors that can't be controlled. All right. Well, interesting topic, and I'll look into it. I'll look into whether or not that has anything to do with hormone change.
Another parent who wants to know, how do you get a child with autism to understand when a parent is hurt and needs their help?
Oh yeah, that's a very, that again goes back to the whole concept of perspective taking or theory of mind, and it is a very, very important thing, empathy, not just with parents, but in general. It's a very important, I guess, characteristic for our children to be able to first of all, identify when someone needs help and then be able to give help or want to give help. So the way that we do it, it's one of our lessons in our cognition program or in our curriculum, and what we do is we act it out a little bit more extremely, and we will start with very, let's say, specific scenarios. In fact, we start out with pictures. So for instance, there's a picture of a girl who's fallen off of her bike and is hurt and is crying. And so we'll set up that scenario, like we'll go through the picture and say, what does this look like? What happened? What do you think she's feeling? And how would you help her? And you have to realize that these are many different lessons that get you to the point where you can actually make sense of this one thing. So I wouldn't try this just with any child. I mean, we try it with our kids once they've already mastered, being able to describe a picture or a scenario, understanding emotions. That's a whole other set of lessons. And then being able to do inferences. Inferences mean looking at some sort of visual, whether it's real life or a picture, and being able to infer something just happened and what was that. So if there's a child standing next to a bicycle crying and it looks like she has a boo-boo, then what happened is she fell, and then basically being able to attach emotions to various scenarios. Obviously, if you're hurt, the emotion that goes with it is you're sad. That's why you're crying. So all of those have to be taught first individually through these lessons, and then ultimately it gets to kind of the empathy lesson, which is, so what would you do? How could you help? And then we go through, I don't know, Shannon, you probably remember better than I do. Maybe.
Well, you're reminding me. I really hadn't realized when Jem was going through this kind of thing what it was leading up to. And you're saying this, and I'm flashing on all these pictures of different times that we were in different locations, and they were teaching him different elements of this until we arrived at the point where people were interacting with him. And one of the key things I'm remembering is that something would happen with me, but there was always another person, whether it was dad or the therapist, that would be a voice in Jem's ear saying,
why is she crying? Why is she upset? What's going on? Exactly. And so we usually, as you know, we start everything two-dimensional because it's easier with pictures. And then once you've done that, then the therapist will act out something. Like they'll come into the room and pretend to slip and fall, or pretend to have a drink fall on them or something, and then have a reaction, and then the child is prompted to really pay attention, and now it's easier for the child because now they kind of recognize the facial expressions, and they recognize, oh, you know, that's the surprised look, or oh, that's the upset look, and these are my standard responses to when someone's upset. And then as we do that, we generalize it more and more and more, so that the child now has new responses and can also pick up more and more subtle cues. But initially it has to be done in the form of a lesson, because our kids, when they see something like a parent or even a sibling like crying or something, their first reaction is not empathy, or oh wow, somebody's hurt, I should do something about it. It's more like, that noise is really bothering me, or so
how is this affecting me?
Very different reaction. Right.
So interesting. I'm remembering all these different times, the different lessons. And it's always fascinating to me, because when we were living it, when the therapists were coming in and doing these lessons, I didn't always know or ask. If I had it to do over again, I would ask, now how does this fit together with this?
Right.
Because now afterwards it's like, I get to see how the puzzle got put together, and how we arrived at where we arrived at. It's fascinating.
Well, so for parents, I think it is confusing. It's kind of difficult because we have, I don't know how many, like, really by the time you start teaching the cognition lessons, there's easily 100 other lessons that have been taught that have come together at this point. It is a higher level lesson. So really, for this parent, I would recommend using skills. Because the order of how you bring these things together is really important. If you start teaching a child something like, look at my reaction, and this is how you should respond when you see this reaction. What you'll get from the child is possibly appropriate, but it'll be very rote. And they won't really start to reason it out and figure out, oh, so I have to pay attention to when other people get hurt, and if it's a child, it'll sound like or look like this, and if it's a parent, it'll be like this, and my reactions are different if it's a parent or an older person, or if it's a younger person, and they're also different based on the level of urgency of the thing that just happened. It's one thing if someone like falls, it's another thing if someone's arm is broken, so all of that, there's a lot in there.
I always have these light bulb moments when you're talking, and I just had the light bulb moment because a lot of times parents will ask about the difference between DTT and ABA, and what I just realized, and a lot of times there's fear around that if we're just doing DTT, that the kids are going to have a robotic response, and they're just going to turn into little robots. And I just realized that the difference between DTT, and tell me if I'm wrong, but in DTT, in that little moment, they're teaching them how to respond, but in ABA, across ABA, they're really teaching them how to think.
That's a really great way to put it. I hadn't actually thought about it that way, because in my world, it's just DTT is a procedure. It's a technical procedure, and it's a really good procedure. It's almost like anything you want to memorize, right? Like, let's say you want to learn any new skill, let's say playing the guitar, whatever it is. You first start out with I guess memorizing notes, perhaps memorizing the locations of the keys on the guitar, very discrete things that set the rules, right? So this is how you use your left hand, this is how you use your right hand, and so on. Very discrete rules. And then you mix and match the discrete rules that you've learned, right? So you can make different sounds if you hold it this way, and then now you're applying more and more complicated things to it. And that's how I see DTT. DTT is the framework. Like, without learning things in discrete sets, it's going to be, I don't know, I see it as extremely difficult and very, it just makes things a lot longer. It's kind of like you're learning things in an unorganized manner. Discrete trial makes it very organized, and as you said, you don't just stop at doing discrete trials, so you don't leave things rote. What you do is you generalize them to normal life, and you apply different scenarios and different sets of rules to what you've learned, so then it becomes really normal.
Yeah. And then when you add in the fact that the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, you guys have been at the cutting edge of doing cognition and executive functions and social skills, and really paring it down to those fine little moments and teachable moments, and then helping to generalize them, it makes it possible.
Right.
I watched you guys teach my child how to think through a problem and consider it from many different perspectives, so that he now does that freely and doesn't have to be prompted to do it. It was fascinating to watch.
Totally.
And the same kind of thing can be done with any child. But as you said, you know, if you're going to get to the point where they notice that a parent is hurt and can respond appropriately, there are so many lessons that come before that.
That's right. And there's, you know, I think what we've done, which is probably it's a disservice, I think, is because we've been doing this for a really long time. I mean, I remember when we wrote the first set of sort of cognition lessons or theory of mind lessons, that would have been, I was still in the Encino office, and I'm trying to think how long ago that was. That was in like mid-90s, you know, so that's a really long time ago for this field.
So you've been doing it a very long time.
So just the very advanced programming we've been doing also for a very long time, and so you don't think about the importance of each one.
Yeah.
So ideally what we should have done, instead of putting everything into our curriculum, and everything is in skills, and so skills is such a massive place for information that I think the individual components don't get highlighted enough. So it's sort of like, you know, the value. I'm sure there are other parents who would love to know how to teach their child this particular skill, empathy, and if we were to highlight just the steps for that in itself might be something. Right.
The recipe. I love it.
The recipe for that. And having said that, though, there's like, you know, 50 other things that are just as important in skills already, including all the steps for this.
So the cookbook for skills, so that you can look up how to get to an end skill and see that these are the 35 things you have to add before you get there. I love that idea.
And actually, though, if you do go into skills, and one of the very good features that they put into skills early on was the search feature.
Yes.
And if you put in there things like empathy or teaching perspective, all of these other lessons will come up.
And the prerequisites for them.
Prerequisites
I love
as
it.
well, yeah.
We should take a break, but when we come back, we're going to have Dr. Doreen answer more of the questions that you guys have been sending in through the night on the live feature, so stick with us. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Doreen. Our very special guest in the studio with us is Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh. We call her Dr. Doreen, and we enjoy it so much when you're here because we get so much good information. We've had a lot of people in the last couple of days writing in about adults on the autism spectrum, and the questions have come in from parents. One in particular here right now: can you guide me to resources for an adult child not diagnosed until after the age of 20, please?
Gosh, there's very little out there. I wouldn't, if someone really has not been diagnosed until 20, then their issues are so mild that you shouldn't be looking for material in the autism spectrum world. I wouldn't.
Okay.
I would imagine that you should be looking more for material in, let's say, the anxiety world. So, you know, depending on what the issues are, and perhaps this parent can write in more next time, I'm just guessing that some of the things you're dealing with are anxiety related, and then if you just read any kind of sort of self-help books on anxiety, there's a lot on anxiety that's very, very useful and applicable to our field. In fact, I do this really long lecture on anxiety and talk about different things you could do to reduce anxiety, because I see that in so many of our kids and adults. So
I'd love to do a whole hour with you on anxiety.
Yeah, we should,
because we've had so many people write in with questions about that, and of course they want questions answered for their young children with anxiety, but a lot of teenagers and adults, and the parents are writing in and saying that they also have anxiety, and we know that that's not uncommon.
Well, I mean, how could you not have anxiety as a parent?
Well, there is that.
As a parent, what you're basically worrying all the time.
Yeah.
So
full-time job.
Full-time job of worrying. And yeah, absolutely. We should do a show on anxiety. I've unfortunately never been able to keep my anxiety lecture to 1 hour, but somehow I'll figure to do that.
We could devote 2 hours to it, make it a two-parter.
It's just that it's fascinating. I think in order to be able to treat it well, it's really important to identify it in autism as well. I mean, people don't recognize the symptoms of anxiety in autism because it's often overshadowed. It's sort of like, oh, that's just part of the autism.
Right.
But it isn't really part of the autism. I mean, even if it is part of the diagnostic criteria, like let's say, hoarding. Like a lot of our kids hoard objects, right? They'll carry 2 things around, or they'll carry 1 thing around, or they'll put their things in a particular place, or they will really need to carry something all the time, or hide it, or whatever. That's anxiety. That's a pure symbol of anxiety, and we see it because if you've been trained to recognize those symptoms, you see it in the kids. Things like, even things like putting things in order or lining objects up, those types of things do imply anxiety. Checking, like going back and forth, those are anxiety type things. Avoiding situations that are difficult, that's anxiety. So there's a lot of stuff that just, first of all, you need to get really good at, like, recognizing, oh, the reason he's doing this is because there's anxiety, and then treating it.
Okay.
Otherwise, we could definitely spend an hour just talking about the treatments, but then I'm not sure so that's kind of why my lecture keeps going long always, is because when I tell people, just think of yourself for a day, like if you are sick, like let's say you've gone somewhere and had something to eat and you don't feel well, your stomach doesn't feel well. It's interesting because the number one problem or ailment that has been contrasted to a feeling of anxiety is gastrointestinal pain. So when you have GI problems, like let's say food poisoning or just your discomfort in your stomach and so on, you feel anxious. It's the same feeling. It's a very similar feeling to when you feel anxious. It's interesting. That's why people often say, oh, maybe you have an upset stomach because you're anxious. No, you don't get an upset stomach from just, mild levels of anxiety, right? It actually is just that they're very similar symptoms, so that we feel they're the same thing. So just think about our kids who have an actual upset stomach. I mean, they have like inflammation of the gut and so on. Think of, and just imagine how much anxiety they're experiencing. That feeling of just kind of like unease, right? Same thing as sleep. Like, how many of our kids don't sleep? If you and I don't sleep, we will definitely start experiencing heightened levels of anxiety.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that it makes it a necessary component. Anxiety there's no question. It's a big part of autism. I should write something about that because people don't realize it yet. Like, it's just something I've been saying for a long time, but it's not recognized. It's not part of the symptoms. People don't talk about it as such.
And yet, as parents, I feel like it's a question that everybody keeps raising. Each week we get a question that has to do with anxiety. Yeah. So I would love it if you would write something.
Yeah, we really should.
It would be a service to all of us. If and I would love to set aside a week.
We should do a show for that. Yeah, absolutely.
If not 2 weeks. Okay, so looking at anxiety, I think that's fascinating. Instead of looking at the autism material, if the child is over 20,
well, if the child's just been diagnosed over 20. That means the individual is very, very high functioning, and otherwise there would have been an earlier diagnosis, or someone would have pointed something out.
A really good point. We're actually going to take another break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some more things having to do with adults on the spectrum, so stick with us. Welcome back. We are here with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh for our segment called Ask Dr. Doreen. We ask you guys to write in on all the different features that we have and ask your questions, and then we give them to Dr. Granpeesheh. As I said before, she does not give child-specific advice, but can help to point us in a direction so that we can get more resources, more information, more help. We had somebody who wrote in via email about their child who is in their late 20s, and she specified that the child got a diagnosis very early on of ADHD and OCD. The mom always felt that there was something more, and now we don't know how recently, but there is an Asperger diagnosis. She writes, he has not been able to hold a job for 2 years now. He lives at home. I'm trying to teach independent living skills. It's difficult as he does not retain material. He sees a counselor, but I question if that person understands his disabilities and how they affect him. I'm not getting any younger and have concerns about his future. Any information or sources of information that you could give me would be greatly appreciated. And she goes on to write that it's extremely stressful for her as that she has some health issues, including MS. And I know, parents tend to break down after years and years and years of stress. We know more and more parents who have autoimmune issues as a result of, things going on with them, and it just heightens. You want to talk about a downward spiral, because then you start to worry about what happens when I'm not here.
Absolutely. I can't even imagine. I mean, I just like my hat off to these parents and parents who handle it and keep going through so many years.
I would like to add too that she gave us more information that he is absolutely adamant about refusing to take any medication. That is off the table for him.
That's fine. So, one of the things I often tell parents when I see them is the labels really don't mean all that much. They help us to kind of classify, but they don't mean much. And this is a really good example of that. So this is someone who was labeled with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, at some point earlier, as well as with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so if you take the symptoms of those two things, so just ADHD and OCD, ADHD would be the main symptoms, and I don't know if it's what type of ADHD, but let's assume it's combined type. So that means that the person has inattention or difficulty paying attention to certain stimuli and certain situations, and perhaps also some hyperactivity. We don't know. But, those symptoms of ADHD, the inattentive type of ADHD, are so similar to autism that traditionally it was very hard for new people coming into the field, new diagnosticians, to even be able to differentiate and say, is this ADHD or is it more autism type or high functioning autism? And really there are quite a few differences actually. The ADHD type individual is much more connected to society than the autism individual. People with autism really do have a very difficult time interacting and understanding other people, and that's a big difference from ADHD. ADHD people, they interact fine, it's just that it's got to be at their speed.
Right.
So they're going really fast, or they're jumping from one stimulus to another and interacting and so on, but they interact, so they know all the ins and outs of how to interact socially. Now, when you combine it with OCD, when you say there's obsessive compulsive behavior, that's where the element of anxiety comes in, right? Because OCD is one of the anxiety disorders. So of course then it becomes a little bit harder, because then now you're entering a world that's similar to ASD, to autism. Because now you're saying, okay, this person has a really hard time paying attention to stuff, and they also have the symptom that's kind of much more rigid. Obsessive compulsive disorder, it's like you're doing repetitive behaviors that could easily be the same as in autism what we call the self-stimulatory symptoms or behaviors. So it's I can see from, if I had met this individual earlier, I would have been able to see how, yes, on the one hand you could say ADHD and OCD, but really it's more Asperger's perhaps, because the combination of OCD and ADHD would resemble Asperger's in some ways. But having said that, let's go back and let's not even care about the label. Let's just care about the symptoms for a minute.
And about getting some progress and
getting some help.
Right?
So this first, exactly. So just to start, and medication is off the table, okay. What you're dealing with primarily is possibly an individual who actually does have difficulty learning and is therefore anxious as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying they're anxious in the same way as you and I would be. So this isn't someone who wakes up early in the morning worried and, tries to do their best to get to work on time or whatever. That's not something. What's actually happening, and it happens in a lot of our patients, is that you have a certain level of anxiety, and if your anxiety is high enough, you'll procrastinate, you'll completely avoid. So what it sounds like with this individual is they really are avoidant. So the way I see it is, the skill set's not there, so the person's having a hard time learning, let's say, independent work skills, and they calm themselves through these compulsive behaviors, which are anxiety reducing, and in the meantime they avoid actually, getting it together and getting a job and so on and so forth, because this skill set is not there, and it's hard for them to actually independently get a job.
Right.
So here you are as mom trying very hard to teach them something that's very hard for them to do, and yes, it can be extremely frustrating and so on. So two places, I guess, we do this. Like, first of all, let me just say this is one of the things CART does. We train our adults and adolescents on vocational skills, and so if you are anywhere close to where we can help you, we would love to do that. We get all kinds of coverage for this.
And you can go to centerforautism.com, click on the locations tab, and see if you're close to one.
Right, and if you're not close to one of our locations, then you can still go on the Center for Autism site and request remote services. That'll be a little bit harder for us to get to you. That's sort of giving you your own supervisor who actually comes to you, but depending on where you are, we might already have supervisors in those areas. We have 200 supervisors and they travel and so on. So we might be able to get to you fast, but we can definitely give you guidance. And if you are close to one of our sites, we'll put a team on your child, and we're fully covered with insurance wherever there is insurance, and we will try to get you help for that. If we're not, and if we can't help you, I always recommend Tony Attwood's material. Dr. Tony Attwood, he's from New Zealand, and he has wonderful books, videos, tapes, DVDs, training materials, I mean, you name it. He really, and his expertise is Asperger's and sort of this group of kids, teenagers, young adults, and he does a lot of work in this area, so I really recommend his stuff. I also recommend Peter Gerhardt, Gerhardt, I think, Gerhardt. He is also fabulous with adolescents and adults, and he specializes in, I think, vocational training.
Okay, great resources. We've had the mom of the 20-year-old that we were talking about before write in some more information, but let's take a break first, and then we'll come back and go back to that question, so stick with us. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Doreen. We're here with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, and she's answering your questions live on the show. So we were talking earlier, we had the question, can you guide me to resources for an adult child not diagnosed until after the age of 20, please? And as we were talking about if they haven't been diagnosed till later, you were mentioning that chances are that they have a lot of skills.
Right.
And the mom has written back and said, no, the issues are huge, that the adult child was not diagnosed until then because the professionals we had would not listen, and they only treated ADHD, which...
Yeah, it's very sad, those situations. And that's usually, I don't know, I find that there are more services and we're a little bit more understanding of these things, I think, in California and perhaps New York, other states. And sometimes when you're looking at more Midwest states or where there really are very little services, then professionals don't have a very good understanding. What am I talking about? I was in Arizona and I was shocked when I was looking at some physicians or teaching some physicians, and they really knew nothing about autism, nothing at all. I mean, they were asking me what are self-stimulatory behaviors, shocking stuff. So I'm just, it breaks my heart when I hear things like that. You really, and when the issues become that huge, I do really recommend professional help. I don't think, it's just so difficult. Even when our kids are little, Shannon, it's hard to take control of all their issues. But once you have someone who's in their 20s, the patterns are ingrained. It's so much harder to teach. It's just so much harder to change behavior at that point. I really do recommend professional help. And of course, having said that, it is harder. I mean, there are many services for young kids and not so many for older kids. We do provide services for adults, And as I said, some of the the experts, I would say, in this field, Tony Attwood's work is fabulous. I don't know where Peter Gerhardt is right now, but if he's anywhere that you can access, he's where I would go.
Okay. And I want to point out too that I so appreciate you saying how difficult it is, because all of the problems that you have with a younger child are so exacerbated when they're older.
Oh yeah.
But and the importance of getting professional help. But I also want to remind everybody that when they get that professional help, that there are solutions and things and progress still can be made at that point.
Right.
Correct?
Oh, no question about it. I mean, these techniques, they don't expire at a certain age.
Right.
Yeah, these are techniques that work on human behavior, and there's no question. It's just, I'm shocked personally, because sometimes now I get involved with kids who are like in their 20s.
Yeah.
Right? I call them kids, but my young adults, and they are like spectacular. They're just amazing.
Yeah.
Like so much nicer than any other. I mean, you can see that what they have learned from ABA over the years, and these are individuals who've probably had a lot of ABA early on. And I still to this day, I have parents are resistant. Parents of older kids are resistant to us doing any kind of discrete trial, because back then, when they received discrete trial, what they received was not quality discrete trial. It was rote, and it never really got the individual to a point where that it would be useful. It's just that simple. So, but when I explain to them that this is just a technique, allow me to do this because this individual has learned, and I have a lot of kids like this now, that we have a lot of older individuals or adults. They're awesome human beings. They don't have behavior problems. I mean, clearly they're just great. They have behavior problems when they're really frustrated and no one's listening to them in any way. Otherwise, they're the most polite, gentle human beings you'd ever meet.
Yeah.
It's just no one listens to what they're asking for. No one pays attention, and no one realizes that, from their perspective, what you're saying doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to play fair when it comes to individuals that are like adults, because they've already gone through a lot and they've developed patterns in order to survive.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
And I appreciate too, not only is it important to get the professionals in because you're going to get it done more effectively, more efficiently, but at that point, the parent has been through so much too.
Absolutely.
And you've got so much emotional baggage, and you've been let down by the system so many times.
This is so true.
That you need somebody to come in and forge the path so that you can follow along.
It's so true. And I do have parents who, I know that the reason they're hugely involved is because they just don't trust anyone anymore. And it's like, I don't understand how in this field, there's so much just separation in this field. I mean, like if you are a psychologist, forget about the fact that ABA came into the world many years ago and is supposed to be focused on these types of issues. But, if you're a psychologist, how can you not understand what a lot of our adults or kids are going through? And I think part of it is because there's this division between sort of psychology and then behavior analysis. Mm-hmm. And so you're either behavioral or you're cognitive. Mm-hmm. And why you can't see people from both perspectives as well as medical, like see all of it together. I don't get it. Why does it have to be one or the other?
But frankly, Dr. Granpeesheh, that's why we need you. And that's why you are a visionary, because I think that not only do you see it from all those perspectives, but you also take the parent's perspective and you take the kid's perspective. I have seen you interact with different individuals at different ages, and I'm welling up here because that is what you do. I think that is, you have so many skills, but I think that is a brilliant skill that I want to learn more about how you take perspective.
Well, thanks, Shannon. I appreciate that, but I know that that's natural for me. I can't understand how my kids see the world unless I try to see it from their perspective.
Wow.
And it's hard. Once you do see it from their perspective, it completely makes sense.
Yeah.
Then you're like, oh my God, now I get it, why this didn't make any sense.
Right.
That's why I love hearing what my recovered kids have to say.
Yeah.
And reading what Temple has written, because it just gives you a whole different understanding of what they're going through.
You're right. It starts to make sense.
It makes perfect sense.
It puts it in context that you go, well, I can completely get that. It doesn't seem odd or weird, the behavior that they were engaging in that seemed odd and weird before.
And it doesn't seem like what's the word, oppositional.
Yeah.
For instance, like, you know how Andy says, Andy always tells me like that he used to hear voices in the background, language sounds were not as loud as things like doors creaking or whatever.
Right.
And if something as simple as that just makes you completely understand why the kids are focused on stimuli they shouldn't be, you know, and why they're not focused on language, for instance.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that. Whereas if you don't really think of it in that way as a behaviorist, you would think their hearing is fine. Why aren't they paying attention to language? Right. It's an oppositional or it's an escape maintained behavior. Like maybe he's just ignoring me. That's not the point, you know?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting when you really learn all the ins and outs. And that a big part of being able to understand things from the perspective of our kids is the sensory. If you don't, and I still don't even come close to, I never would claim that I understand all the sensory issues our kids go through. There are so many, and I can't even begin to understand. But I know that some of my kids can't focus. I know some of my kids can't see moving objects. I know some of my kids can't hear various sounds well. I know that some of my kids constantly need pressure or something on their skin in order to calm them down. I mean, there are a lot of sensory things going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great information. We're going to take another short break and come back right after these messages. Stick with us. Welcome back to Autism Live and to this particular segment called Ask Dr. Doreen. We have with us Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, who is an expert in the field of autism, but also a visionary.
Oh, thank you
we
very much.
so appreciate all of your insights that help us to be able to do the things that we want to do with the individuals who are on the spectrum in our lives. And we had a question come in on the live feature. Dear Shannon and Dr. Doreen, you both look great today. Flattery will get you everywhere. Quick question. For a child age 6, what would be the dosage for Tranquil Sleep when given at nighttime? Like to have an idea. Thank you so much. You are the best.
Tranquil Sleep comes in 3 milligram tablets that are chewable, and age 6, it depends. 3 milligrams is depends on your child's body weight, really.
Okay.
So if it's a typical 6-year-old, I'd probably start with half of that, break 1 and a half.
Okay.
And then you can work it up from there. But I mean, it's not. As an adult, I can take 6 milligrams, so I could take 2. But then, some 6-year-olds are pretty big and they don't have, so like when my kids were 6, I guess 1 tablet would have been okay for them.
Okay.
But I mean, melatonin is a relatively harmless thing. And I would say you're looking at 1 to 3 milligrams for a 6-year-old.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of different questions about emotions and teaching emotions to our kids. One to start about teaching them how to express. How do you get your child to show his emotions whenever he's upset and not express his emotions from a movie? Yeah, I have to think about that a little bit, because first of all, I don't know enough, I don't know how much your child has already gotten ingrained in the whole movie thing. Sometimes our kids get into scripting. Basically, they'll be watching movies and then they'll take language from the movie and use it. And it becomes so, I guess, overly, just takes over a lot of their language, because they pretend to be in the movie and then they use mostly scripting, and that becomes a little bit hard to break. If that has actually happened, you need to cut down on the movies for a little while just to reduce that from happening. And then there's our emotion lessons are, oh my gosh, it's one of our largest social lessons, and I would say there's maybe 20 different lessons involved in just teaching expression of emotion. And so it'll start from very basic recognition of emotional features and recognition of emotion based on scenarios or settings, and then appropriate ways to express, which are many, and different. So if it's let's say a male, their expression of emotion will be quite different than a female, and so on and so forth. So there's too much for me to want to describe here, but it is very doable. Absolutely, you just have to teach the child step by step.
And like anything else in ABA, what you're really trying to do is prevent one response and replace it with another. So I guess what I'm saying is, in order to prevent the scripting, just cut down on the movies for a little while, and then teach the appropriate types of expression, some of which are scripted. You know, I mean, some of it is language when you express. You know, if you do use Skills, our online program, and if you go in there, you'll see there's one of the charts which kind of lists all the exemplars, and this is like all the different ways to express emotion in reaction to different things. So all the different ways to express sadness, happiness, etc., etc. Then you have to find different ones that are appropriate, that you feel are appropriate to your child's age and gender and so on, and then you will teach those. And it's not very hard to replace you know, one type of response for another.
Okay, so slowly, systematically, and all those lessons are in Skills.
Yeah, they are all in Skills, and you know, it would be very hard for me to try to tell you, because I don't know what emotion, I don't know the age of your child, the gender, I don't know how much language they have, I don't know, but Skills would be able to take you through all that.
Okay, cool. Now, this other question that we had about emotion, it's a lengthy one, so I'm going to cut some parts of it. Is there a way to teach embarrassment to a 10-year-old on the spectrum? She goes on to say, I have a 10-year-old who seems to understand my emotions but still does not feel embarrassed. She gives an example of when he's walking up to school and that he will walk in a way that would attract attention, and that for another child not on the spectrum, kids would make fun of, and then they would feel embarrassed. And she's trying to change the way that he's walking up to the school. She prompts him and makes him go back and do it over again. She's wondering if that's the right way. She goes on to say, I'm wondering if the consequence I'm providing is the right direction. Should I always be priming him about his behavior? And again, is it really possible to teach embarrassment? And she goes on to thank you very much. She's watching and using Skills.
Oh, wonderful. Good. That's great. So yes, it is very possible to teach embarrassment, but I don't think your child is making the connection just from hearing what you wrote here. Because embarrassment has to do with, if you think about what embarrassment has to do with you know, not liking how other people think about you. That's what causes embarrassment.
Okay.
So embarrassment naturally involves perspective taking. It has to. If you don't have the ability to take other people's perspectives, you will never be embarrassed. Because you could go out without any clothes on and you wouldn't care, because from your perspective, everything's fine.
Right.
Okay. So embarrassment comes with theory of mind. You have to have perspective taking. And this scenario, I think the way walking to school and making certain noises or sounds or whatever to behaviors that attract attention, I don't think the child is understanding that this is embarrassing. Okay. Now, he could possibly, and I don't know the child well enough, he or she could potentially, and what you would do is videotape the behavior to going to school, and maybe even videotape other children reacting to it, and then show the video at home and talk to your child and say, look, did you see what you did? And look at what they're doing. Why do you think they're doing? Why do you think they're laughing? They're laughing because it sounds funny. It isn't normal. It isn't good. You shouldn't make these sounds. I don't think they want to be friends, that kind of thing. But that would only apply if your child was already at a stage of development where they cared about having friends and looking good. If your child isn't there, then that's not the right way to go.
Okay.
So it's just not going to make any sense, because then to your child it just won't make any sense. Like, who cares how they're reacting and so on. So then I would back off, and for this particular scenario I would just say no noises or no whatever. I would just make it very basic and say, I don't want you doing any of this. So the connection that you make, you know, like let's say, you know, sometimes we tell our kids, you have to, I don't know, go to sleep at a certain time. Okay, and that is very personal, and there's no real rule about whether you have to sleep at 8 or 10.
Right.
There isn't, right? I mean, but we make these rules. We say 8, 8:30, 7:30. You have to be in bed. Whatever. They're rules.
Yeah.
And so just make a rule in terms of when we walk to school, it has to be quiet.
Okay.
You could do a lot of things to make that happen. Obviously, you could play music in headphones. You could help teach the child to count in his head. You could teach the child to make noises in his head, like making noises inside versus outside is something we do as well.
Yeah.
So there's all that sort of stuff which could control the behavior for that period of time. And you're not really approaching the whole area of embarrassment unless your child really is, coming home sad and saying, I don't know why anybody wants to be friends with me. I don't have friends and all this. Then you really do want to approach that. And then you do want to say it has to do with how you behave.
Yeah.
And look at how you behave.
And it sounded like she really would like for him, I don't think it's just about the behavior, that she would like for him to understand embarrassment and be able to apply this to other circumstances.
Right.
And so to answer her question about can you teach it?
He might, absolutely you can, but then you have to go back and make sure he understands perspective taking.
So start there.
All of cognition, like the theory of mind, perspectives, sensory perspectives, you remember those lessons?
Oh, yes.
All have to precede this.
Some of those lessons were really fun. We had a good time with them.
They're fun, but they're long and they're difficult. So you do have to teach the child, all the different perspective lessons. I'm trying to go through my head right now. So senses, sensory perspectives, thinking, knowing, beliefs, desires, intentions, all that sort of stuff.
And she's using skills, so she's got access to all of those. Now, I would say as a parent, because I remember the day that my child for the first time felt embarrassment. And I was there, and he was in kindergarten, and a moment happened, something happened, he said something. The teacher had said, we're going to have a holiday party at kindergarten, and everybody can put on your holiday dress, was what she said. And she was meaning, dress like what everybody is dressing in. And my son, who was trying to acquire language, said, I have a holiday dress that I want to wear, misunderstanding the word dress in that context. And all of the little boys started laughing and pointing at him. And he turned red, and he turned to the teacher, and he said, they're not laughing with me, they're laughing at me.
Oh.
And it was this moment, right? And right after, and the teacher dealt with it, best teacher in the world, dealt with it, and then sent them out to the playground. And I was crying. And she came up to me and she said, I'm so sorry, and he's okay. And I said, no, I'm crying because he felt embarrassment.
Yeah, it was the
and
first time.
There was a huge, huge leap for him. But but there was also a part of me that I said, now we have to double down on how he deals with embarrassment. You were always and still are very, just like, you understand him so well, and you're so aware of his issues. I don't know about that.
You are, and that is what makes our kids successful. Because as a mom, and that's how I do it too with my kids. I'm constantly trying to figure out, like, okay, and that what you said is so true. The minute our kids become aware of certain things around them, then you really have to work on their self-esteem issues, being able to handle losing, being able to handle all of that sort of stuff. So it does come naturally, and it, giving them some stuff to fall back on and some support is also very important. So just going back to this mom, I would say, don't go to embarrassment yet. Trust me, it will come. When your child has adequate perspective taking and theory of mind ability, they will feel embarrassed when the time comes.